Now let's look at the translation constraint. The translation constraint allows us to constrain the position properties of one object with the position properties of another. In this case, we'll constrain the blue circle to the position properties of the red rectangle. To add the constraint, let's first select the ellipse and then go into the inspector and add a new constraint. To add the constraint, we just need to hit the plus button and then select the type of constraint we want. In this case, we'll use the translation constraint. You'll notice that once we select the constraint, it appears in the constraints list. If we click on the plus button again, we could add an additional constraint. Keep in mind that any object can hold multiple constraints. We can click on the text field to edit the constraint name, and in this case, we'll call it translation blue circle. We need to continue to configure the constraint, and we can do that by using the options here. When the menu opens, you can see we have a bunch of options to change, but the most important is the target. As we said before, we want the blue circle, which is the constraint owner, to copy the properties of the red rectangle. If that's the case, then we'll want to set the red rectangle as our target. So we can use the target button, and you'll notice that the editor changes and lets us know that we need to select a target. And we'll go down and select the rectangle directly on the artboard or via the hierarchy. You'll notice that now that we've selected the rectangle, the blue circle automatically snaps to the same position as the red rectangle. And if we try and move the circle, you'll see that it can't move. And that's because the property's been constrained. But if we move the red rectangle instead, you'll see that the blue circle moves along with it. In fact, anything that we do with the position property of the red rectangle will also be copied by the blue ellipse. So if we center it using our align tools, we're also centering the circle. Let's look at some more constraint properties. We've got two properties down here called copy X and copy Y. If, for example, we only wanted to copy the X position property, then we could uncheck one of these properties. So in this case, if we uncheck Y, it's not going to take the vertical movement into account anymore, only the horizontal movement. Now, the reason for this is, once again, we told it not to copy our Y position by unchecking that box. We can also define a range of values that it's copied between by using the minimum and maximum. So let's say in this example, we set our minimum to 100 and then the maximum to 400. We're telling our constraint that the minimum value the property can be is 100 and the maximum is 400 on the x-axis. Now let's see what happens when we move it. If we move the rectangle inside the middle of the artboard, it's normal, but as soon as we start going outside of that defined range, you'll see that the ellipse stops moving, and that's because it's respecting those limits that we set up before. We can deactivate the constraint at any time. The first thing that we need to do is make sure that we select our shape and then go into the constraints and toggle this little eye here. Now, you can see that when we move the rectangle now, nothing happens, but if we go back and toggle it back on, that it snaps back to the rectangle again. Another option to keep in mind is the strength value. By default, the strength is set to 100%, but we can change this. At a value of 0%, the constraint is basically not applied to the object. If it's at a value of 100%, it's copying all the properties one for one. But sometimes we want to change that value to something that's less than 100, so maybe let's say 20%. And now you can see that if we move the square, that the circle is just moving, but with less force. Another interesting thing about the strength property is that we can animate it. So in animate mode, what we can do is have the square animate from one side to the other. You'll see that if we play back the animation, that the square is moving normally and the ellipse is sort of following along with that 20% strength. Let's go back to design mode and set the constraint back to 100%. And if we go back to animate mode and look at the animation, you can see the difference that it's following it one for one. Now let's key the strength value and see the difference. So at the beginning of the timeline, we'll go ahead and set the strength to 100%. You'll see that when we click the diamond that we're going to set a key. And then if we go, for example, to the middle and key the value down here, we can change it to 0. When we play the animation back, you'll see that the rectangle moves and the ellipse stops moving at some point. And it's a little bit gradual because it is interpolating between those two values. This technique can be used in many circumstances, specifically when we want to turn a constraint off in a particular state. To remove the constraint, we have two options. The first is to right-click on the constraint, and you'll see that we have a little drop-down menu appear, and we can hit delete, or we can hit the Alt key or Option key on Mac, and the X appears. Now, if we click on the X, then the constraint goes away. Now we're going to create the constraint one more time. So we'll select the blue circle, add a translation constraint, and we're going to do something different. Instead of selecting the target first, like we did last time, what we're going to do is use the offset toggle, and then we'll select our target. Now what this is going to do is have our object respect its position in relation to the red rectangle. So once we hit the target and select our rectangle, you'll notice that instead of moving on top of the rectangle, it stays offset from the rectangle. And even though we're at a strength of 100%, the object is moving, but it's moving at that offset location. Now remember, we selected a translation constraint, so if we scale the object or rotate the object, then nothing is going to be applied to that ellipse. It's only the position properties that matter. Let's explore one last thing that we can do with translation constraints. So this time, we're going to select the object and create another translation constraint, just like we've done before. And instead of selecting a target, we're just going to leave that blank. So that means that the object is actually targeting itself. This allows us to set min and max limits for our object. Since we don't have anything selected now, we can move the rectangle freely. But if we, for example, set the min to 200 on the X and the max to 400, when we move the object, you'll see that when we try to get to less than 200 or greater than 400, our object is being limited. This technique can be really helpful if we want to, let's say, make a slider and not have that object move beyond a certain point. We can use this with most other constraints as well, like limiting the scale or rotation of an object.